Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. And it's my pleasure to welcome to today's program Paul Lomas, who is VP at Ryder Supply Chain Solutions. And we're going to talk about the important role of packaging in supply chain network design and optimization. So, this is one of those topics that probably doesn't get talked a lot about, but it's certainly a critical aspect of supply chain management. Before we dive into the conversation, I just want to remind everyone joining us today that we like to make these conversations interactive. So if you've got a question for Paul along the way, feel free to ask the question via the submit a question button or via the chat feature, and I'll keep an eye on it. And if any good questions come up, I'll try to weave them into the conversation. If you are logged in as a guest, you will have to register first in order to be able to ask a question. So with that, Paul, thank you for joining us today.
Oh, Adrian, thank you for the opportunity to join you. It's a real pleasure.
Well, before we get into the topic of packaging and supply chain network design optimization, I always like to ask my guests for provide a picture of their kind of the background and their career path. You got to get a sense of kind of how you got into the industry. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your career path and experience and how and why you got involved with supply chain logistics?
Oh, certainly. Actually, I kind of fell into the profession, Adrian. When I was going to school, I ended up working in a manufacturing plant. Actually, it was an automobile manufacturing plant. Working on the floor, supervising assembly lines, doing some engineering work. So when I was in college, I touched manufacturing. When I finished school, I took a job as in inventory management also in the automobile industry. So first job right out of school, it was, again, touching another aspect of supply chain. Following that, I began to work in the consulting profession and took a job with a fairly boutique consulting firm, and at the time, well ahead of its time in terms of dealing with logistics topics and logistics issues. And frankly, that's where I got hooked on supply chain and logistics as something I really enjoyed. It was the variety of the disciplines, the fact that you could shape a supply chain and execute it to support a business strategy or even a point of differentiation. I just really was fascinated then and continue to be so now. I left consulting after several years, and now I'm part of Ryder, obviously a logistics service provider. So my whole career has been supply chain and logistics, but like many others, I kind of backed into it, Adrian.
Yeah, that's pretty typical of a lot of executives that I talk to, and in fact, it's similar with me as well. I started out in manufacturing, and even though I was doing supply chain management at the time, I didn't really realize it until further down the road. So let's talk about packaging now. I guess to kind of set the stage, I think it's probably important to kind of define packaging, right? Because I think it means many different things to many different people. Can you walk us through kind of the different types and levels of packaging, and which type has the most impact on supply chain networks?
No, that's actually a great place to start, Adrian, with that exact question, because you're dead on. The various types of packaging and the terms that go with it, depending upon the audience or even the company, they get used slightly differently. So for purpose of this conversation, at least how we're using the terms inside Ryder, let me level set us along three specific terms. The first one would be contract manufacturing, and typically that refers to a manufacturer, for an example, subcontracting an entire manufacturing process to an external entity. Food manufacturer might be a great example, where they would subcontract to a contract manufacturer the whole process, all the way from ingredients, running them, processing them, creating a finished good, and packaging them into a retail-ready package. That would all be done by a contract manufacturer. So contract manager, kind of ingredient to retail-ready. That's one term. The second term would be primary packaging. And that begins when the product is in a semi-finished state, a work in process, if you will. And primary packaging takes the work in process all the way through to converting it into retail ready kind of packaging. So, bulk crackers or bulk candy would then be packaged through a primary packaging operation into a retail ready output. So that would be primary packaging. The third term is secondary packaging, and that's a process where the product is actually already in a retail ready package. Secondary packaging reconfigures that product into some other retail ready package. A toothbrush and toothpaste, each of which might be individually ready, get repackaged together in yet another form of a retail ready package. So that would be secondary packaging, the reconfiguration. So contract packaging, it's ingredient to retail ready. Primary packaging is a work in process to retail ready. And secondary packaging would be a retail ready package into a reconfigured retail package. So hopefully that helps clarify at least how I'll be using the terms today. I think you also asked about impact in terms of that kind of packaging on the supply chain. And that's a difficult one for me to judge which has a greater impact than the other. And here's why. Because in many ways, they're oriented towards different needs. Contract manufacturing and, to a degree, primary manufacturing are used by manufacturers when a manufacturer doesn't have the capability, doesn't have the right kind of equipment to package a product, or it needs extra capability, extra capacity because it doesn't have it in-house. So the need driving contract manufacturing and primary packaging tends to be around the need for capability. Secondary packaging is really driven in many ways by the retailer. As retailers look to merchandise the shelves differently, they're going to want a food manufacturer's product in a different kind of package, maybe combined with another product, all in the attempt to differentiate their store from someone else's. And as a result, SKUs get expanded, product lists get expanded, and packaging becomes a way to deal with that in somewhat of a supply chain cost-effective way. So secondary packaging is driven a lot by the retailer's merchandising strategies, and contract manufacturing and primary packaging are driven much more so by the manufacturer. So they're going at different needs at different points in the supply chain, and all of them have had an impact on how supply chains are now working.
Yeah, great points, Paul. I think it's just based on your comments, you can see kind of how broad this whole topic is and kind of the different drivers that impact packaging and how packaging is influenced by on the customer side, by the retailer, how there are internal considerations with respect to the manufacturer and so on. So very good, kind of foundational knowledge there to kind of know where we are. We've had previous conversations. You've made the point that a lot of companies are kind of under leveraging their packaging operations. In other words, they haven't really analyzed where they should be doing it and how to use it more effectively. Can you give us some examples of how companies are under leveraging their packaging, and what are some of the reasons that packaging seems to fall through the cracks in supply chain decisions?
Yeah, sure. When I use the term under leverage, I'm really reacting to the whole notion that many of the customers that we work with, they're still driven by taking inventory out of the supply chain, speed to market, being responsive to demand, running supply chains which are lean. And in their quest to do that, packaging can play a role for sure, particularly as it relates to postponement strategies. And ideally, you want to exercise postponement to its fullest degree and push the packaging process out as close to the customer as it makes economical sense to do so. Put it in the market, if you will. And in many cases, we see companies who have established and are still working with packaging that's done in one or two locations. They have not pushed it out to the marketplace. And so, in my words, they are under leveraging the potential of packaging. An example would be a manufacturer, and this happens to be a real example, a manufacturer who has a plant in Tennessee. They manufacture the product, then ship it to a secondary packaging capability in Chicago. And from that Chicago location, it's then distributed across the United States. Now, that particular kind of packaging capability that's being done in Chicago is available in the Southeast, the Northeast, even the West Coast. But the ability to recognize that there's supply chain advantages, potential supply chain advantages, by doing that packaging in locations other than just one and other than just in Chicago, and pushing packaging out to the market, and that is somehow getting lost. And now, why is that happening? Why could that happen? Well, in our way of seeing things, there's a couple reasons. One is that by virtue of the fact that packaging is somewhat unique, somewhat specialized, where the packaging decisions get made inside an organization are typically removed from the supply chain functions. Decisions about packaging can get made in marketing, they can get made in manufacturing, they can get made even in some cases in the R&D function. So as people in those functions make the decision about where to do the packaging and how to leverage it, they do so primarily on the basis of capability. Is the right kind of packaging capability available? And if so, then that's where it gets done. Options and bringing to bear, if you will, a landed cost kind of approach typically are not used. And the supply chain functions aren't really asked to offer counsel or advice on how to make a decision from a full supply chain perspective on where packaging ought to be done. So it tends to be a very compartmentalized kind of decision. That's point one, and it's done that way because of organizationally where packaging can fit inside large corporations. The second point is that in those compartmentalized kind of decisions, on occasion there is some attempt to think about alternative packaging locations and to do it from a landed cost point of view. But because the supply chain functions aren't typically involved, the landed cost approach tends to use some very imprecise logic about, I'll take an example, transportation. That's a big part of landed cost analysis. We've seen companies just use plug numbers or use miles as an indicator of transportation cost, rather than using a more rate-based, more market-sensitive way to estimate transportation costs. As a result, the decision-making, arguably are not fully informed relative to how a packaging or where packaging should be done. So organizational issues get in the way of making a fully informed decision. Even methodological issues get in the way of making a fully informed decision. It's a hard word to say.
Yeah, it can be a tongue twister. It's interesting that you mentioned total landed cost, because that's a topic that I certainly am hearing more and more about with with manufacturers and retailers trying to get their arms around total landed cost, and certainly a topic that we've talked about on this program as well. So kind of making the link and the role that packaging plays, within total landed cost, I think is something that we hadn't talked about in the past, and I think it's kind of an important insight that you made there in terms of, particularly since many companies are looking at, strengthening their capabilities around getting a more accurate and more complete total landed cost, that, this is a key component of that equation. The other thing you talked about was postponement, and that was going to be my next question. I mean, I see a number of companies where they're linking packaging with their postponement and sustainability strategies as well. And I assume you've seen the same thing with the some of the customers and companies that you work with. Can you give us some examples of how packaging, how companies are using packaging to enable and enhance their postponement and sustainability strategies?
Yeah, actually, Adrian, before I do that, if I could return to your prior question just for a couple additional comments.
Go ahead.
Yeah, the packaging decisions, when it's made in those compartmentalized pieces of the organization, I mean, they're focusing on certainly important elements of that decision. I mean, if one needs to package candy in a stand-up bag, or put cereal in a cup, or put crackers in a pouch, or frozen vegetables into a 1-pound pouch, I mean, finding capabilities to do that obviously are got to be pretty paramount in terms of driving the decision. But when there are alternatives to where those kind of capabilities exist, it's there that the total landed cost approaches typically are not introduced. So I'm trying to give some credibility to the fact that decisions about packaging focus on capability, as they rightly should, but the overlay about total landed cost is not necessarily always done, or if it's done, it's often done in a very imprecise way. So the decisions are not necessarily optimal. Now, in terms of postponement, Ryder operates probably, or within the CPG vertical of Ryder, consumer packaged goods vertical of Ryder, we operate probably 30 distribution centers across the United States. And in large measure, inside every one of those facilities, we do some form of packaging, typically secondary packaging. And over the past 5 years, we've seen a steady increase in the volumes in those facilities of the secondary packaging kind of work. And in particular, an acceleration in the rate of volume growth in the last couple of years, where volumes now are substantially higher than they were even 2 or 3 years ago inside those DCs. And that goes to the whole notion of postponement and delaying adding value and doing the kind of secondary packaging work that we do inside the four walls of the DC. Financially, that makes a lot of sense as you work with less inventory, you're more responsive to the demand, and you're able to convert and add value at the last possible moment. And postponement strategies, particularly as they center around packaging, are becoming much more prevalent in terms of how we are talking with companies about building and operating their supply chains. Now, not unusual that when something makes sense financially, it also makes sense from a sustainability standpoint, and that's true in packaging as well. When you push packaging out to the marketplace, do it inside a DC, you're working off leaner inventories, which require, in theory, less warehouse space, less utilities, so forth and so on. You can often get a benefit too by virtue of the transportation capabilities into the facility. Much more dense, therefore less transportation costs. Carbon footprints are positively affected. The whole notion of postponement has financial benefit and also sustainability benefit. Makes sense one or both of those ways.
Yeah, no, great, great examples, and particularly with the sustainability side, I've seen a lot of initiatives over the past few years where, companies are looking at, packaging and across all levels in terms of ways of being able to, fill put more product per case, more cases per pallet, be able to fit, more product per truck. That way, have to send out, fewer trucks out there. And that's kind of another kind of lever, in terms of how they're using packaging from not only a cost standpoint, as you just said, from a financial benefit standpoint, but also from a sustainability effort. And certainly, looking forward with, potentials for, capacity shortages on the trucking side and things like that. Those are all kind of some of the strategies that I see a lot of companies, a lot of shippers doing that involve packaging, to, hit upon all those angles: cost benefits, sustainability benefits, and kind of almost like risk management from a truckload capacity standpoint.
Yeah, that's very true, Adrian. Very true.
So I just want to, we've got a couple of more questions here. I just want to remind, our guests that if you do have a question for Paul, anything that he's, talked about so far, or maybe something that you'd like to ask him, now's the time to do it. And certainly, if it's a good question, we have time, I'll try to weave it into the conversation. So, obviously, you work at Ryder, and in your role there, you work with a lot of different companies, including, those that where packaging is a key component of their supply chains. At a high level, what is the role of a 3PL as it relates to packaging and supply chain network design and optimization? And, if I'm a shipper, what kind of attributes should I look for in a 3PL, as it relates to this area? What kind of questions should they ask? What kind of capabilities should they look for?
Well, in terms of a 3PL capabilities or Ryder's capabilities, we can help companies all the way from, supply chain strategies, how you would set up a distribution network, or how you would attach a distribution network to different kinds of manufacturing capabilities. We can help companies design supply chains. And within that design, we obviously focus on postponement strategies, and in that, packaging is obviously a big part of that, both secondary as well as primary. And as a 3PL, we then can take those designs, those strategies, and execute them, and provide the transportation capabilities, the warehousing capabilities, the packaging capabilities, both primary and secondary, to be able to land a product retail ready at the lowest landed cost at the effective service levels. We do that for across industries. I happen to be, as I mentioned, in consumer packaged goods. We do the same kind of thing in high tech and retail and automotive. But the capabilities are very broad, all the way from strategic all the way down to operational, and multidiscipline in terms of transportation, warehousing, and packaging.
So would you say that a common starting point for companies, kind of an engagement with customers, is on the kind of the strategy side and the kind of network design optimization side? Kind of try to get a baseline, look at where they are today, kind of then see what opportunities might be available to them moving forward?
It's not unusual that we get into strategic kind of discussions with a customer or client. More typically, we're talking about how to improve operations inside the four walls of a facility, or how to operate packaging more effectively, or how to move product via transportation more effectively. So more often than not, we're coming in at an operational kind of capacity. But from that, we get a sense of really how the business is working. And at that point in time, we can bring perspectives from other customers, other industries, to kind of say, here's how it could work. And in that kind of conversation, typically we get into some of the more strategic conversations and strategic issues. So we attempt to bring to bear the whole gamut of capabilities, strategic all the way to operational. And starting points may be different, but we leverage across the set of services.
Great. So as a way to kind of wrap up, kind of this part of the conversation. I'll have one more question after this. But in terms of packaging, I mean, what steps should companies take to make make sure that they're leveraging their packaging to the fullest potential for supply chain benefits? In other words, how would you complete the following statement? You're best in class in leveraging packaging in supply chain if what?
Well, if for sure you're applying a legitimate landed cost approach to consideration of where packaging gets done. That's point one. And point two is if you're sure you have leveraged the postponement strategies to the fullest extent. And by that, pushing semi-finished product or finished product out to the marketplace where the primary or secondary packaging can be performed close to the market, and therefore set up a supply chain to become much more responsive to demand, much more efficient in its use of inventory, and lower cost in terms of its delivery to the customer.
Great. Well, we're almost out of time here, so I'll wrap up with the question I always like to ask my guests as well. So we started the conversation with you kind of giving a little bit of background on your career path and experience, and you've had a great experience so far. So my question is, a lot of the folks that we like to communicate out to at Talking Logistics is young professionals as well as students. So, what advice would you give to young professionals and students, those folks just, starting out or getting ready to start out their careers in supply chain and logistics? And, what are some of the things they should be doing today to kind of pave a successful career path down the road?
Well, first, I congratulate them on their choice of professions. It's, so supply chain is one of those unique roles where you get visibility across the company into what manufacturing is doing, what marketing is doing, what you need to do from a customer service standpoint, and certainly what the business needs to do from a strategy standpoint. It's a unique role. So, however one enters the profession, my key piece of advice would be keep your eyes and ears open and learn as much as you can about the adjoining functions across the supply chain, so that as you progress through your career, you're able to understand how they relate, how they work together, and how they can therefore contribute to a success of a business strategy.
Great advice, Paul. And with that, we're going to wrap up here. We didn't get any questions today, but certainly if you've got any questions for Paul after the fact, or if you're watching this on demand, actually a lot of our viewers tend to watch these shows on demand, and you've got a question for Paul, you can go ahead, go to talkinglogistics.com, the website, find this episode, and post a question there, and I'm sure Paul would be happy to answer it after the fact. So with that, Paul, thank you very much again for making the time to be with us today.
Thank you, Adrian, for the opportunity.
Great, and thank you for everyone for joining us today. Always a pleasure having you, and we look forward to seeing you in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.